Welcome to the second of two expert panel discussions on saving our rainforest from future bushfires. I'm Tony Parks, President of Big Scrub Landcare, which is presenting these discussions as a truncated form of the 2020 Big Scrub Rainforest Day, which normally is an event that attracts up to 4,000 people at Rocky Creek Dam. This year, because of COVID restrictions, we are restricted to this online panel discussions. Big Scrub Landcare is a large and successful landcare group, which in the 23 years it's been in operation has played a major role in helping to save Australia's critically endangered lowland subtropical rainforest. We thought that because of the great community interest in the impact of the fires on our local rainforest, particularly in the Nightcap and surrounding areas, that we should get together a group of experts, which we have in both discussions, to talk about the impact of the fires, the lessons we can learn, which was the first discussion, and the second discussion deals with what on-ground action should we be taking to minimise the impact of future fires, and what we should be doing practically in terms of fighting the fires to ameliorate those impacts on the rainforest and its priceless threatened species. I'm delighted to welcome as convener of the second panel discussion, Mick O'Regan, a well-known media person and a local in this area, who I'm sure will elucidate a lot of interesting information from the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mick.
It's a pleasure to be part of this year's Big Scrub Rainforest Day. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where we meet today, the Widjabul people of the Bundjalung Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. In the preceding panel, we dealt with two questions. What were the major impacts of the bushfire event of the 2019-2020 season on the rainforests of the Nightcap National Park and the surrounding areas? And secondly, what lessons can we learn from that experience? In this second panel, we're going to follow on and develop those themes. In order to minimise the impacts of future bushfires on our rainforests and our threatened species, what are the strategies and on-ground actions that should be pursued? And secondly, how should bushfire management be improved? To help answer those questions, we're joined by an expert panel, and it's my pleasure to introduce them now. Dr. Robert Kooyman is one of the most credentialed and knowledgeable botanists in the area of rainforest ecology in the world. Among his many professional roles, he's a research fellow at Macquarie University and a research associate at the Royal Botanic Garden, Sydney. Matt Wiseman has worked with the Queensland and now the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service as a ranger, a senior field supervisor, and now as team leader for the Richmond River area. He's worked extensively in fire management, from burn planning, reserve fire management, and wildfire suppression. David Milledge is a field ecologist engaged in vertebrate research and wildfire surveys in northern New South Wales. He's worked in this capacity for more than 50 years, for state and local governments, NGOs, and as a private consultant. David specialises in forest ecology and threatened species, and right now he's currently monitoring threatened species populations, including the large forest owls and post-fire response programs. And last but definitely not least, Oliver Costello is a local, a proud Bundjalung man from northern New South Wales. Oliver co-founded the Fire Sticks Alliance Indigenous Corporation in 2018. He has a broad range of experience in Indigenous fire practice. He's passionate about caring for country, Indigenous leadership, empowerment and recognition of cultural knowledge and practice through community-led mentorship on country. I extend a warm welcome to our panellists. To begin, Matt, could you provide an overview of what you think are the key strategies and on-ground actions that are needed to minimise the impact of future bushfires on our rainforests and their threatened species?
Yeah, so my role has been to conduct these post-fire assessments and do the mapping of where these fires have travelled through the Gondwana reserves, not only in Nightcap but further west through the border ranges, Mount Nothofagus, Mount Cluny and Karela and Tulum. And I'll just start off with a couple of observations of what I've seen, and then I'll bring that back to Nightcap.
Sure.
But basically, those core areas of rainforest have held fire. Fire has tracked those wet sclerophyll and emergent communities through Nightcap, which is almost a textbook example of fire moving along through those sclerophyll communities to the edges of the rainforest areas. And we have had a couple of burns that were done in the last 12 months that were effective in protecting the edges of rainforest. And one of these was down in Bundjalung National Park, where we did a planned burn in June of 2019. And the Mole Creek fire came into that block and went out, and that actually protected the littoral rainforest adjacent to it. Another block was up in Tulum National Park, where we did the Wallaby South planned burn. And the fire moved under quite a head of steam in the middle of the day and actually went into this block that we'd burnt in the year before and went out within 500 metres, protecting rainforest further to the north of that block with an uphill run. Another one was a wildfire a year previously in Yabra National Park, and the Bengala fire moved into that block probably 200 metres and then went out protecting rainforest to the northwest. So they're just a couple of observations. In terms of Nightcap and protecting rainforest and threatened species, I think it's a two-pronged approach there. We need to review our reserve fire management strategy and have a look at what our strategies are in terms of protecting key population nodes of threatened species, and also where it's appropriate to put planned fire into the landscape in those dry communities and in adjacent wet sclerophyll communities where appropriate, because that has previously been through King in 2008 has shown that fire adjacent to rainforest can mitigate fire going into those rainforest areas. Having said that, I don't think it's appropriate to put planned fire into emergent communities or wet sclerophyll with a really well-developed rainforest understory. We're looking at those wet sclerophyll communities, you know, with an open grassy, sedgy, ferny or a heathy, or you know, a little bit of a mix of some mesicy rainforest species and some shrubby species. So I think there's definitely merit in looking at these areas that we can put a fire cycle in to particularly blackbutt forests adjacent to catchment areas that do have threatened species in them to aid fire suppression activities to protect these threatened species in those areas. And that will all be done via the reserve fire management strategy and the RFS risk planning and be done with a review of environmental factors as well. And then the second part is specific incident action plans that provide guidelines for firefighters with geo-referenced maps to actually protect these specific nodes that we identify that are vulnerable to a second fire. And that's the data we're collecting now, and Rob is also collecting, that we want to look into which of these threatened species cannot respond, you know, well to a fire, and that we really need to be able to protect those and identify specific operations, whether we have out-of-area crews or local crews. We can hand them this incident action plan and go, this is your job. And it outlines exactly what they have to do with geo-referenced maps so they can locate to these sites and protect these iconic species and these special species.
Thanks, Matt. Rob, I'm going to go straight to you. In terms of your assessment of how the practice unfolded, take us through what either your critique or your observations are.
I think, well, these were very large-scale fires. Their extent was large, and there were multiple fronts. So it spread quickly and it stretched resources. So the realities of dealing with all of those issues at high speed, and there were always going to be constraints. So in essence, what's happened is that fire has burned to the edge of the rainforest in general. And if we think about the rainforest residing or having contracted to refugia areas where they're safe from long-term impacts of climatic oscillations and events, then they're already contracted to refugia. So what's happened there is that we've observed the fact that along the edges of the refugia, the fires generally went out. But in a few notable exceptions, of course, there were incursions of fire. And there's also the legacy of past history, which is logging and disturbance. And so that activity has compromised some of the buffering edge forests. It also ended up with large areas of rainforest has been cleared in the past. So the refugia has been contracted. And so within that context, there was also, incursions of fire into areas of high value, simply because of the concentration of threatened species. So there's a number of factors that have played out, all of which, of course, informs us clearly that what we thought was safe wasn't safe, that refugia works, but we need to be actively managing and understanding how it works and how we play a role in managing those things. So I think there's much to be learned, and there's a great deal of benefit to come from, I think, as Matt suggests, looking in more detail at the planning processes.
I'd like to foreshadow that the issue of the deployment and the amount of resources seems to me to be important in this. But before we get to that, Oliver, I'd like to now come to you. In terms of Indigenous fire practice, as someone with that body of knowledge, how do you look at the events of last summer?
Of last summer? Well, I guess there's some mixed results. I think in some of these landscapes it's good that we're seeing fire, it's just that it's not the right fire that we want to see. And I think that's what we've learnt from our old people, that you've got to apply the right fire for country. And one of the first lessons I learnt a long time ago was that, old people used to burn off rainforest to protect rainforest. That was a critical part of being able to, not just in these areas, in the Big Scrub, but all across Australia, where particularly rainforest pockets can be quite isolated and highly susceptible to fire, where you'll simply lose them. So being able to understand that is critical. And then I guess just trying to raise that awareness around the right cultural fire regimes and how important they are to be able to protect biodiversity, threatened species, life and property, and increase people's understanding and connection to country. So all through the Big Scrub, rainforests, there were cultural pathways that old people travelled through, and they used to burn along those pathways. The grassy ridges and grasslands and open areas and stuff that interlaced the rainforest and other forest and ecosystems. It's really important to understand that kind of cultural landscape and the opportunities that we have to learn from this recent fire season. There's going to be opportunities that we haven't had to be able to get in there and start to do monitoring and restoration work, restoration burning, to start to give ourselves that advantage going forward, so that we can try and mitigate what are going to be increasing events, I think, in the future.
David, from a fauna perspective, what are your thoughts?
Well, look, a lot of the points, Nick, that have already been raised, I agree with. But I think initially what we really need is a detailed inventory of what remains, what we've lost and what remains, so this can inform future planning. Not just an overview, but a really detailed inventory mapping with ground truthing of the wet areas, the really important refugia, and some of the important elements that we know are critical to maintaining habitat of the threatened species, particularly the big old trees, the hollow-bearing trees. These are hundreds of years old, and we've lost a lot of these with the 2019-20 fires, a lot. Some of the plots that I've been looking at, admittedly in drier sclerophyll forests, have lost or had the large old trees severely damaged. Up to 20% of the trees, of those large trees, have either collapsed or they've been severely damaged from the fires. So we need to know where these are in the landscape, where stands of them are, so we can protect these in the future. We need monitoring of key species, particularly what we call the tumbulin species. These are the species with lineages, the Gondwanan lineages back 30, 40 million years. And it's interesting to note that of the 28 species of strongly rainforest-associated vertebrates in Nightcap, 54% of these are Tumbunan. These are the old species. And they seem to be the most fire sensitive, along with Rob's observations of the Gondwanan flora. The Gondwanan fauna also seems to be the most sensitive. So we need that. We need some very detailed modelling of climate change scenarios for the Nightcap. Erect a digital elevation model and go from that perhaps, but not just a sort of general overview. We know what the predictions are in terms of rainfall, drought, high temperatures. They're all very scary, but in order to be able to manage biodiversity in the Nightcap itself, we need that detailed modelling. And then of course, I think these fires have shown that we need proactive work. We need a strategic set of fire trails. We need, from our inventory, we need to know where the really critical wet areas and the stands of the big old trees are, so that we can have fire trails that are designed to protect these areas, where we can get in before the fire and rake the debris away from the bases of the large trees so that they don't incinerate after the fire front has gone through. That sort of thing. So yeah, there's a whole lot of different issues, I think, that have been raised by these fires that we need to move on very quickly, because the climate change scenarios, and climate change really is the issue here, I think. They're scary, the scenarios down the track, and you know, I predict we're looking at this sort of catastrophe within a decade.
Which immediately suggests the scale of the work that has to be undertaken. And I'd like to come to this issue of resources and come back to you, Matt. Do you think that the resources available to National Parks and Wildlife Service and the people fighting these fires was adequate? And do you think that there are, for example, the regular deployment of defence personnel, the engagement of the Indigenous community, that in a rethink of resources, that's where we need to go?
Yes, more resources are always welcome, but we need to realise that to be an effective on the fire line, you need years of training and the right training, past fitness tests, to be of use to be able to deploy to do certain roles on those fire lines. And I'll just take it back one step to understand these fires at Nightcap, because they didn't just kind of move through the landscape. When that fire initially started on the western side of the Terania Basin, it's run up a western slope with blackbutt, and then where it's hit the ridgeline, the northwesterly wind has blown the embers over the Terania Basin onto the eastern side. It's then run up the eastern side, spotted over the rainforest on the Nightcap Range, and landed over in the North Rocks Road area, and then onto Mount Jerusalem. So these fires aren't moving straight continually through the landscape. They're spotting from ridge to ridge, and that's why some fire trails become redundant, because the fire's already gone over the top of them. So I just wanted to pick up that point that's important. I'd just like to also just talk about the containment of the fire. So initially our strategy was to try and keep the fire out of the Rocky Creek catchment area where the threatened species were, and we were successful for doing that for the first 4 days, until we had a severe fire weather day on the Tuesday, the 12th of November, and the wind swung around from a northwesterly that was predicted to northeasterly and ran up the eastern slope, spotting into the catchment area. So although fire trails can be really good if the fire is running along, ground fuels, under those severe conditions, we often find that fires are spotting long distances ahead of themselves, and the fire at Washpool actually spotted 20 kilometres ahead of itself out into country. So fire trails is part of the answer. The other part is this burning, reducing the fuel loads in these areas, and also enhancing the biodiversity of these wet sclerophyll forests as well. So we can't just rely on fire trails with it, and we also need to accept that every now and then, in 1968 there was a large fires that burnt similar areas in the northern rivers through Nightcap, Mount Nothofagus, the Border Trail, and even burnt the Murray Scrub in Toonambar, what is Toonambar National Park. sometimes these conditions are very, very difficult to control fires in. And there's no, one answer or one solution to combat these.
Rob, your thoughts on resource allocation?
Well, I think, not being within the organisation, I can make a plea that government and others better resource our national parks folks, and that we see, RFS and national parks and other agencies that are involved fully resourced and adequately resourced. I think as a community, that would be something that we would hope for. And as an ecologist, of course, I would hope that would then translate, as Matt has suggested, through better planning, better management, and not suggesting that previously there hasn't been good management, but just that the resources be there to allow that to occur, that preemptive management can be undertaken, that there can be better liaison with local Indigenous people, and that we have a growing awareness as a community of the different roles that we can all play, and that those roles are fully resourced. And I think what we saw was a huge amount of resources after the fact, and what that tells us is that the resources are there. So the question then, I guess, is should we wait for the emergency and the disaster, or should we be preemptive? And I'm really hoping that out of this we have the strength as a community to ask and demand for better resourcing.
Oliver, from the perspective of the Indigenous community, what's the feeling there about their capacity to be engaged as a resource?
Well, I think there's a strong appetite for First Nations people to be, I guess, once again carrying the fire stick in the landscape as our old people did for thousands of years. And so there's a really, strong aspiration there, and there's growing capacity. And I agree with Matt. We need more. We need more resources. But it does take time to build the capabilities, and we've got to understand the difference between wildfire response capabilities and what's involved in training for that, and other, prescribed burning activities. There's two different types of, fire response there that needs to be considered. And then there's a whole raft of other land management activities as well. So I think more resources, but it's also about how we deploy them. And obviously, Fire Sticks has been working with Bundjalung and Githibal, Yaegul, communities all across Australia around building up that capacity. We're asking for support for a culturally accredited, nationally recognised training program that can actually build the capacity of our people to maintain our practices. We're not just talking about using our current knowledge system, which is age old. We have to adapt to current regulations, new planning rules, climate change. There's a whole heap of different things that are happening that we need to be able to be supported to skill up in as well. And we feel that we're well placed to do that because the climate's been changing for thousands of years in these landscapes, and our old people have adapted with that change. They've used their knowledge of country, their relationships to the resources, their kinship with each other to adapt that knowledge through reading country. There's never been a more important time for us to actually come together and understand that ability to read the landscape with all the parks, RFS, forestry, everybody come together and use the knowledge that we have and use that knowledge at a local level, because that's one of the problems that I see is that we're trying to, the state's, guidelines around fire thresholds are not fit for purpose for the northern rivers. They were developed somewhere else, and we need to understand what are the fire regimes that are right for this country. And when we walk through the different ecosystems, we're applying the fire regime which is right for that, which for some country is no fire. But that's a fire regime. You've got to understand that consciously protecting rainforests from burning is a fire regime, and we need to understand to do that, how we do that is about burning those other bits of country and not just waiting, because the wildfires, like the fires that we've seen happen in the last year and across a huge part of Australia are going to lead to more fire. And we're going to see climate change driving extreme weather patterns, and there's going to be the fuel there, and there's going to be the ecosystem disturbance there, which is going to lead to more fire. So we need to be really proactive. So I think we need to reorganise those resources if we want to make the change happen on the ground.
And it occurs to me as you speak, Oliver, that deep cultural knowledge and timeless practice has to come up against the obvious constraints and the regulatory frameworks that an organisation like yours needs, Matt. So what are your thoughts on how to integrate that kind of knowledge and practice into what National Parks and Wildlife Service needs as far as ensuring quality outcomes and consistent practice?
Yeah, so firstly I'd like to say I agree with Oliver on the local guidelines specific for the Northern Rivers in terms of fire thresholds, and I'm working with our planning officer to try and get a project officer on to be able to do that important work. Secondly, National Parks does have a cultural burning policy, and we do support cultural burning in park, and we work with our traditional owners in our joint managed areas, and we're currently working on burn plans at the moment with our traditional owners so that they can implement burns on park. So there is regulation around that, and we still, if a cultural burn is to happen on National Park, we need to develop a burn plan with those traditional owners and ensure it still meets due diligence processes, and we still need to follow the legislation. But we do have a pathway to do that, and we are working on that. And I think it's really good of National Parks Fire Management working alongside the cultural fire management with our local traditional owners.
David, your thoughts?
That fire management definitely has a role to play in the Nightcap area, Mick. And in fact, it probably has an important ecological role in terms of maintaining tall grassy forests up against rainforest. And they're probably diminished currently from what how they existed in the past. But they're a suite of fauna that have adapted to these grassy forests, tall grassy forests, up against rainforest. The eastern bristlebird is a good example of that. We don't even know whether that's still in the Nightcap. But generally, in the Nightcap area, I'm not in favour of using control burning in the wet sclerophyll and the moist sclerophyll forests, because there are so many studies that have shown that this just promotes flammable vegetation and makes the next fire much more extensive and hotter. But definitely, I think we need to be looking at using traditional burning methods in some areas where we're trying to maintain these tall grassy forests.
Rob, do you have a thought on this question?
I think it's interesting in the context of the Nightcap, because Matt and others are charged with managing those areas, and there's a legacy issue there that's out of their control, which is historic logging and a lot of disturbance, which has left the forests more flammable in areas where they weren't originally as flammable. So what we do know is that if you let forests grow old, they burn less fiercely. So in other words, you've got big trees, 1 metre, 2 metres or more in diameter. They're wide spaced. You've got an understory that's relatively sparse, or in some cases is a well-developed rainforest. And so you've got a situation where it's not fire promoting. The fires that will travel through there will generally trickle around. But what we've done, of course, is clear-felled those, put the trees in at high density, eucalyptus, the commercial species, allowed a brushy understory of acacias and a range of other species, and that's fire promoting vegetation, and it increases the intensity of the fires adjacent to areas that were previously relatively, if you like, described as refugia, core moist refugia, protected areas. And so that's an exacerbating problem. But part of the solution to that, of course, is to be strategic about how you manage those through time, and to let some of those forest areas in key areas grow old again, get big again. And that's 200 years of European settlement has transformed the landscape. And so part of what we need to discuss here is how do we get some of that back? And how do we get decision-making and planning processes that align with that give us back old growth, that give us back country that's got all those values? And that's a wonderful challenge.
Is it fair to say that necessarily we have to rethink logging?
I would suggest that yes, we do, because basically that's a disturbance paradigm that's been let run too far. And so that's an industry-driven scenario and that it's not ecological. So what we're talking about here is ecology and people interacting, and the legacy of bad management and mistakes, where we get a resource-driven approach that drives the forest to submission. And so that industry is still strong, and the demand in the community is still relatively strong. So we've got conflicts. We've got issues that we need to resolve there, but we do need to make some key choices about how we manage landscapes in the long term. That short-term perspective is we've proved it's destructive. And it has confounding problems that exacerbate management, our capacity to control fire. All of those elements converge, and when we set that against climate and various other variables, we've got major challenges. But I think we have the means to think our way through landscape as well.
So to move on to kind of planting and looking forward, in heavily burnt areas such as large patches of lantana and other weeds, should we consider planting appropriate rainforest species to complement and facilitate natural regeneration and minimise future weed infestation? I'm happy to go, Matt, with you, and then to Rob and to Ollie.
Yeah. So from our plots we're setting up, or we've set up and we've done 6 of them, we're monitoring where fires come to the edge of the rainforest on the ecotone, and we've got 15 by 20 metre plots, and we're measuring inside that all the woody response from the rainforest species. And what's not commonly known is 70 to 80% of these rainforest species can reshoot from their main stem even when it's completely burnt. And we're also getting about 500 rainforest seedlings coming up in those plots. So the rainforest is regenerating, and it can cope with a single fire. Okay, so I think if you've got an area that is pretty natural, then it's going to regenerate itself, and what you really need to do is just take out those weed species that are competing with your native species that are coming up.
Ollie or Rob, just on this notion of weed infestation and weed control as a key element of strategy?
Yeah, I think on the lowlands, in natural areas, I completely agree with Matt. I think we should intervene as little as possible and let the natural processes do their thing, and the natural successions and regeneration should be nurtured, perhaps with a little bit of judicious weeding if it's necessary at all. But in other areas on the lowlands where we adjoin, lantana infested gullies and maybe the lowland rainforest adjacent to large areas of lantana or other weeds, I think there's definitely scope for interventions in those cases. Fortunately, that's pretty rare in national parks. They've done a lot of work in terms of getting rid of large areas of legacy weeds again, but on the foothills of the border ranges and the Nightcap and elsewhere, as we move towards the private land, we get large areas of those sort of issues, and there's a great opportunity there, as the Big Scrub Landcare Group has proved over many decades, that those weeds can be controlled, and that either natural regeneration or supplementary planting can have a role in nurturing those regenerative processes.
As far as fauna is concerned, David, the relationship between weed infestation and the impact on fauna?
Yeah, well, in the long term, I think, Nick, it has an adverse effect, but I would caution about broad-scale, quick removal of large swathes of lantana, large lantana patches, because a lot of the ground-dwelling birds and mammals depend on lantana for cover, to be able to escape from their predators. A number of, as I mentioned, ground foraging birds and species like the long-nosed potteroo, Palmer wallaby, red-legged paddymmelon, they depend on lantana for cover to escape predators. So I think it needs to be done in a staged, in a mosaic type pattern. I'm not sure how lantana has been affected by the fires. I haven't personally inspected a lot of these areas, but I have heard stories that quite a lot of lantana did not burn it actually survived the fire. So it's going to be an issue, obviously, very, very soon, if not already. But I would just caution that broad-scale removal of lantana because of its cover value for a lot of these species of fauna. But you know, ultimately, in the long term, it suppresses a lot of rainforest species that these specialised fauna depend on.
Do you think generally that lay people need a deeper understanding of the relationship around that? There's a notion of lantana, let's just get rid of it. There's a notion of this. In fact, it's a more complex story.
I do. And
what are your thoughts on how that knowledge can be promulgated?
Well, I think it's just a matter of getting the facts out there. But camphor laurel is another good example of that, where we see broad-scale removal of camphor laurel across the landscape, and a number of the fruit pigeons, because of past clearing, because of that legacy of clearing, a lot of the fruit pigeons, which are a threatened species, depend on the camphor laurel, particularly in the winter, for food resource, because most of their winter fruiting food trees have been cleared, particularly in the lowland areas. So again, I'd caution about broad-scale, wide-scale removal of camphor laurel. I think we need to keep some of these elements, these weed elements, in the landscape while the natural vegetation recovers.
Mm. And Oliver, a First Nation perspective on this question?
Yeah, I think I agree with the commentary really. You've got to read country and you've got to adapt, you know, and so you've got to have a bit of a plan about what you're doing. And so I think in a lot of circumstances, yeah, there needs to be a focus on that assessment, monitoring and those restoration activities before we start trying to intervene and plant things, because there is a legacy of things being, those interventions sometimes creating, you know, not the effect that we were trying to achieve. So just having that level of understanding is important. And following protocol. So there's all this kinship sort of protocol that, you know, like traditionally was in place around where things would be healthy and where they weren't. And fire was one of the ways we would moderate that. But there'd be other ways like, you know, harvesting things and picking things and moving things around to maintain and supplement, because natural regeneration on itself in some areas isn't going to achieve the outcome that you want. So being able to understand, this is what belongs here, and being able to introduce that species into that area in a respectful way for that country is really critical. So it's just that, yeah, I think it's about people developing a connection with place and understanding the values of that place, and then how they can contribute. And that's what our old people developed over thousands of years. And I think, you know, people are continuing to develop that. That's who we should be supporting, the people that have that level of understanding, not just good ideas, kind of misguided interventions, which is what we've seen a lot of in the past. And people are trying to do the right thing, but it's also having that ability to access knowledge and share knowledge with people to be able to progress the good outcomes that we all want to see.
Right, thanks.
And having modified the country so profoundly, as Dave points out, we end up with these almost contradictory necessities of management where what becomes the most important resource, or one of them, is the capacity for some of the fauna to retreat to a safe refuge. And that even though there's food enough in the landscape, the patches of forest have been so reduced in area, even the national parks are small. And the consequence of that, of course, is that there's now feral predators, and the pressure on these terrestrial and other vertebrates is extreme, and so they need those retreat spaces as well. And as we've seen in some of the reserve areas, you know, you can actually lose species through time, and I've seen that in my time working in some of these forests where, you know, once upon a time quolls on the border ranges and elsewhere were prolific, and now you rarely see them. And in some other areas, they used to be on right to the coast, now they're absent. As Dave knows, the potoroos around Tioga and elsewhere, you could actually occasionally see them. Now they're, for all intents and purposes, absent. So this is happening around us, and it's partly a consequence, of course, of that legacy of European clearing and disturbance. And so we end up with, in some places, weeds have a role to play.
Mm. Now I want to come to a really iconic species and one which you'll be forever associated, because in 2002 you were the first person to identify the nightcap oak. In terms of a species like that, I have an initial digression. Do you think the nightcap oak is getting poor play compared to the Wallamai pine as far as an iconic plant species is concerned? But on that, what do you think should be done to better protect a species like the nightcap oak? Does it present an opportunity for us to think through what we need to do when we're faced with that kind of rare species?
Yeah, well, I guess the answer the first question first, which is that nightcap oak, we deliberately made decisions with national parks in the first instance to keep that relatively low key and secret, and for a number of years in the threatened species realm to do the work before that information became more available. Relative to Wallamai pine, which as a research associate with the Botanic Gardens, I'm guilty of promoting Wallamai as well, and that was a strategy that parks and the Botanic Gardens undertook. So they're both incredibly important and equally so. One's a conifer, one's a flowering plant. They're iconic, but we took different approaches to how they were promoted. And of course, Wallamai was grown extensively and planted, and so very different outcomes there. So, and you know, in terms of Idathea, the nightcap oak, it is, for the nightcap, it's an iconic species, and it's symbolic of the Gondwanan World Heritage Forests. We have other species like on the border ranges, Eucryphia jinxii, which is another species, the leatherwood up there, that's constrained to a very small area and just creeps across the New South Wales border. So we have a number of these Gondwanan taxa, these lineages that represent that incredible deep time history, and that's an expression of evolutionary outcomes and ecological survival. And that's a breathtakingly beautiful survival story. It's part of our shared history and legacy and the natural history in which we're privileged to live. And so you know, those sort of species have a great role to play in terms of, I guess, motivating us, but also from the science perspective. I have colleagues all over the world who these are iconic for them as well. And the Gondwanan forests of our area are of major concern to them in the context of increasing climate change and all of those variables. So I'm privileged to be able to respond to them and let them know how their research contribution is helping us to manage and understand, and these forests provide us with an incredible window into the past, but also for the future.
The final area that we have in the time we have left I'd like to discuss is actually on-ground firefighting in Nightcap National Park. And Matt, I'll come to you first. What lessons can we learn from the recent fires to improve bushfire management to minimise impacts of future fires?
Yeah, so there's a number of strategies there that we can employ, and I touched on them earlier with we need to, as Professor Ross Bradstock did a 2016 report on planned burning in the Nightcap, and we need to look at strategic areas where we do introduce fire, as Oliver talks about, to protect rainforest, and also to increase the health of those wet sclerophyll communities that we are putting fire into. And then we need to strategically place them around, you know, that affect fire pathways, as I've talked about. You know, fire trails aren't always effective because of fire spotting, depending on, you know, uphill runs of fire, when fire reaches certain points. So we also need to put in strategic fire, which will be through the review of the fire management strategy for Nightcap, and then also we need that second backup of specific protection to those nodes of threatened species, that we have specific plans attached to our reserve fire management strategies that can be quickly given to people, whether it's, you know, local crews or out of area crews, and they can understand what their role is to protect those specific nodes. So they're some of our key areas. And also touched on before that those fire seasons don't come around that often. That may increase in
change, of
time.
course, yeah.
That's correct. But last major fire season for the Northern Rivers was 1968, which burnt those similar areas. And firefighting in those conditions with that dry level of soil dryness, that temperature, low humidity, strong northwesterly winds is when we tend to get our major fire runs. Is difficult, and there's many solutions there to try and protect our rainforest and our threatened species from fire.
Thank you. I'd like to ask other members of the panel your thoughts on this last question, the actual on-ground practice, your assessments, and what you think maybe recommendations are. David, could I start with you?
Well, look, I think I've touched on this to a certain extent, Mick, but proactive management I think is really important. And I think we probably in the Nightcap need more strategic fire trails than we have at the moment. I'm not usually an advocate of fire trails because they encourage invasive species, introduce predators, that sort of thing, pest species. But I think we've got to put that aside in terms of the Nightcap because of these very, very special areas that we have to protect. And I think if we can get more access, particularly for preemptive, proactive measures, I think that's probably going to help us in the long run. And also, I know it's not always practical to get into these areas after the fire front's passed, but in some cases it's been shown that if you've got fire trails that can be opened up after the fire front's passed, then fire can be extinguished in areas where it can be prevented from doing further damage. So I think the fire trail issue is something to look at, but yeah, the preemptive, the proactive part of it, I think is probably the most important.
Thank you. Oliver?
Yeah, I think maybe some time before there's a significant fire event like this in the future, but I think likely with climate change and the impacts of this recent fire that it will come much quicker than it has in the past. But I think the key thing is about that proactive management. Like I'm obviously advocating for cultural fire management. I'd love to see more Bundjalung fire practitioners supported, economically supported and mentored and supported to be out on these landscapes, not just burning, but accessing resources, hunting, camping, maintaining cultural relationships to the land, because I think if people understand the benefits of that, there'll be more support for it. And I think that's been the challenge, that people have misunderstood, I guess, those resource relationships that all people have, and they see hunting and gathering and camping as negative things. But if you understand the impacts that they can have in a positive way, if you follow the laws, you follow, Bundjalung cultural laws and protocols about what and when you can take things and where you can take them from, you'll see more proud cultural custodians in the landscape, which are going to be communicating and implementing fire so that when the next fires do come, you can stand up more people, and those people have got fire experience and they've got connections with local communities. Because I think that's one of the challenging elements of this thing is and there's a lot of good, capable people, particularly in national parks, but a lot of people responding to the fire just simply don't have the fire experience and that level of understanding of the cultural and ecological values to be able to, on the ground, sort of participate in what can be quite a command and control scenario. So trying to skill up people that have local knowledge, they know their backyard and they know the back hill and they have a better understanding of the way fire behaves in their landscape under certain scenarios. That's going to help inform people like Matt and others that they're having to make informed decisions. And I think so building that in practice instead of waiting for another 20 years or whatever it might be, to then go, how do we, because you can't, it's really hard to maintain that capacity, like training cycles, employment cycles. It's really hard to maintain that capacity over long periods of time without having proactive measures that actually enable people, not just in this landscape, but also beyond. So people are getting informed by how fire behaves in different ecosystems in different climates as well.
Thank you. A last comment, Rob, to wind us up.
Yeah, I think what we've got now in the landscape are core areas of refugia for the Gondwanan rainforests and for the communities that the Gondwanan rainforest interacts with, and they're predominantly national parks. Within the national parks we have smaller refugia areas, and those refugia need to become priorities for protection. And so the infrastructure, knowing those places that have the threatened species, but also knowing those places that protect the core areas of Gondwanan rainforests, and how we might better improve the outcomes for that in the long term and under changing conditions becomes a real imperative, I think. And I think everybody is you know, pretty much in agreement that that's the strategy. And then within the matrix of disturbance that we're seeing with the fires, you know, we have like First Nations people concepts of increased sites and things like that, where the beauty of those sort of ecological insights, what that captures is that even in a fire matrix there's patches that don't burn. And that then you really do need to manage those as well to make sure that they're protected for a while, so that from there the species can expand outwards, that there's resources for your animals, and that within the matrix of the local refugia and the larger refugia we get a coherent way of dealing with how species survive in these landscapes. And I think, you know, that when I first read about that, when I first thought about that concept of increased sites, I thought, wow, that is so ecological. That is so cool.
Yeah, can I just add to that? Because I think that's one of the things about building that level of understanding, like I was saying before, like people are, there's important places in durable increased sites, you know, for all these species where singing songs and dancing and getting people on country is land management. And it's something that everybody can connect to, and it helps us to build that narrative and create those opportunities. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so invigorated by cultural fire management, because we can bring people together. It's not a military operation that only certain people can be involved in. It's actually an activity that, you know, kids and elders can be involved in circumstances where it's safe to do so, and that builds connection. And connection is a critical thing that we all need to be able to look after the country.
Absolutely, and I think that's a wonderful note to finish on, that note of connection. I'd just like to say that out of this conversation, I hope that the one thing is that we kind of understand that respecting and understanding our past to help it inform our future is going to be a way forward. I'd like to thank you all, Rob Kooyman, Matt Wiseman, David Milledge and Oliver Costello, for being part of this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, mate.